Welcome to the deep dive. So picture this.
Yeah.
You're an entrepreneur, you've got this amazing startup idea, one that could really genuinely make a positive difference, tackling some social or environmental issue.
Yeah, something with real impact.
Exactly. And you pour everything into applying for one of those, prestigious impact-focused accelerators. They're seen as these golden tickets, right? Offering money, mentoring, legitimacy.
But getting in is just incredibly difficult. Our sources mention, a median acceptance rate around only 15%?
15%. It's a tough scene. And for most people who apply, it's just silence or a polite no with almost zero feedback.
Mm-hmm. You're just left completely guessing what went wrong. Was it the idea, the team, the market?
Right. You assume it's all about the business plan, market size, maybe your team's background. But what if there's something else, something kind of external, maybe even out of your control, that's quietly playing a pretty big part?
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. This deep dive is sort of pulling back the curtain on a surprising factor that some new research suggests accelerators are actually considering, maybe subconsciously, maybe not.
We're looking at a really interesting study. It's from the British Journal of Management. The authors are Gaganis, Papadimitri, Pasiouras, and Tasiou.
Yeah, and they analyzed thousands, literally thousands of applications. And what they found is pretty remarkable. It seems like the perceptions around the ethical climate of where the founders are from that acts as this powerful, maybe hidden signal to the selection committees.
So our mission today is to unpack all of that. How can this, seemingly outside factor actually influence who gets that crucial yes?
Let's start with the basics, maybe. These impact-oriented accelerators. How are they different from, say, your standard tech accelerator?
Good question. Because we hear a lot about the tech ones, right? Focused on scaling fast, big financial returns.
Totally. Laser focused on the financials. But these impact ones, they have a dual bottom line. They are explicitly set up to help startups create real, measurable social or environmental good, as well as being financially sustainable.
Okay, so they're looking for businesses built around solving problems, maybe like helping underserved groups or giving access to vital stuff.
Exactly that. Positive change is baked into their DNA. And that's precisely why ethics becomes so incredibly important for these ventures.
Right.
The sources really stress this. For social entrepreneurs, values and ethics aren't just optional extras. They're fundamental to the whole mission.
But I guess even with the best intentions, ethical issues can still arise. Maybe mission drift or something.
Oh, absolutely. The study points that out. Even these really mission-driven companies can hit ethical bumps or, experience mission drift, particularly when they start needing external funding. A lot of them are for-profit, remember, which adds its own pressures. So showing strong ethical foundations right from the start is seen as kind of a prerequisite. It gives confidence they'll actually stick to delivering that positive impact they're promising.
And the accelerators themselves, they care a lot about this too.
They really, really do. You can think of them as sort of gatekeepers or legitimizing agents. And crucially, a lot of impact accelerators get their funding from public bodies or philanthropy.
Wow.
So those funders need to feel confident their money is backing ventures that are genuinely committed, that won't misuse funds or, behave opportunistically.
Makes sense.
So admitting founders who seem ethically solid helps the accelerator keep its own reputation intact, attract more funding later, and basically build a network of alumni who are seen as positive role models.
So they need that trust in the people, not just the pitch. But how do they actually judge that trustworthiness, especially with really early stage companies where there's not much track record?
And that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's where the studies theory comes in. Accelerators face this classic problem called information asymmetry.
Information asymmetry, meaning one side knows more than the other.
Exactly. The accelerator doesn't have perfect information about the startup team. It's really hard to objectively measure squishier things like integrity, trustworthiness, the likelihood someone might cut corners later on.
Yeah, you can't just run a report on someone's ethical character.
You really can't. So the evaluators often have to rely on, signals, things they can observe. And this study uses two main theoretical lenses. First is upper echelon theory.
Okay, what's that?
Basically, it suggests that the backgrounds, the experiences, the values, even the personalities of the top leaders. So the founding team here strongly influence how they make decisions and how the company behaves.
So who you are shapes what you do as a leader. Makes sense.
Yeah. And the study kind of stretches this idea. They propose that maybe broader country-level attributes like the the general perception of corporate ethics in a country could be, let's say, loosely related to the values of founders from that country.
So using a national perception as a rough proxy for individual values, that's interesting.
It's a bit of a leap, but that's the idea. It's trying to get some handle on those hard-to-see individual traits.
Okay, so upper echelon links founder background to potential behavior. What's the other theory?
That's signaling theory. And this fits perfectly with that information asymmetry problem. It says that when you can't directly see important qualities, you look for observable characteristics that might signal those hidden traits.
Like maybe dressing professionally signals competence or something like that.
Kind of. In this context, the study's big hypothesis is that the general perception of corporate ethical behavior in the founder's country of origin, that perception acts as an observable signal.
A signal about what?
A signal to the accelerator about the founding team's likely trustworthiness and their potential for opportunistic behavior.
Whoa. Okay. So if I'm a founder applying and I was born in, say, Denmark, which is generally seen as having high corporate ethics, that perception might send a positive signal about me personally to the accelerator committee.
That's the core idea they set out to test. It takes the country of origin effect we sometimes see for products, but applies it specifically to the founders themselves based on where they were born.
Wow. That's a pretty bold connection, taking a very broad societal perception and linking it to a specific decision about individuals. How do they actually test this? What data did they use?
They managed to get their hands on a really impressive data set. It covered over 16,000 applications from early-stage ventures.
16,000? That's huge.
It is, from 131 different countries, applying to 287 accelerator programs, all between 2013 and 2019.
Okay, massive scope. So how did they measure this perceived ethical behavior? You can't just ask the founders, right?
No, they needed something standardized. They used country-level data from the World Economic Forum's Executive Opinion Survey.
Ah, the WEF survey. I know that one.
Yeah. So each year, it asks business executives to rate the corporate ethics of companies in their own country on a scale. A higher score means better perceived ethics.
Okay, so a country gets a score based on what executives there think.
Yeah.
How did they link that score to a specific startup applying?
Good question. For each startup application, they identified the top 3 founders listed. Then, they took the WEF corporate ethics score for the country of birth for each of those founders.
The country of birth, okay.
And they averaged those scores. So if you had 3 founders born in 3 different countries, they'd average the ethics scores of those 3 countries. That average became their measure, their proxy, for the venture's perceived ethical signal based on founder origin.
Got it. So it's an average based on where the key founders were born, reflecting that country's perceived corporate ethics level. Did they account for other things that might influence getting in to make sure it wasn't just, richer countries getting picked more often?
Absolutely crucial. They controlled for a whole bunch of stuff. On the venture side, its age, whether it had revenues, if it was nonprofit, if it was based on some new invention, whether it held patents or trademarks, things like that.
Okay, venture characteristics. What about the countries involved?
Yes, they also controlled for the economic climate of the country where the venture was headquartered, specifically GDP growth and inflation. The whole point was to try and isolate the specific effect of that founder origin ethics signal.
Makes sense. You need to strip away the other explanations. And they use stats to see if that ethics score predicted admission.
Exactly. They used logistic regression. It's a standard statistical tool for this kind of thing. It lets you see how much one factor, like the ethics score, increases or decreases the likelihood of an outcome getting admitted while holding all those other control variables constant.
All right, let's get to it then. After crunching all those numbers from 16,000 applications, what did they find? Does where the founders were born and the perceived ethics there actually connect to getting into these impact accelerators?
Yes. The answer is a pretty clear yes. The study found a significant positive relationship.
Positive meaning. Better perceived ethics, better chance of admission.
Precisely. Ventures where the founders came from countries with higher perceived corporate ethical behavior were statistically more likely to get accepted into these impact accelerator programs.
Okay, wow. So that signal, that perception based on country of birth, it actually seems to work. Can they put some numbers on it? Like how much does it really matter?
They did, and the numbers are quite striking. So, holding everything else constant, if you take a venture and increase its founder's average perceived ethics score by 1 standard deviation, which is like a standard statistical jump, the odds of that venture being admitted increased by about 1.14 times.
So roughly a 14% increase in odds for that standard jump, that's not insignificant.
It's definitely noticeable, but here's a more dramatic comparison they made. Think about the venture in their sample with the absolute lowest perceived ethics score based on founder origins. It was 1.16 on the scale. Now compare it to the venture with the absolute highest score, which was 6.28.
Okay, lowest versus highest perception.
On average, the venture whose founders came from the country perceived as having the highest ethics had odds of getting admitted that were 5.85 times higher than the venture whose founders came from the country perceived as having the lowest ethics.
Wait, nearly 6 times higher odds just based on that country-level perception?
6 times higher odds, holding other factors constant. It's a massive difference, and it really underscores how powerful the signal seems to be. When accelerators are facing that uncertainty, that information asymmetry about who they can really trust, this perception about the founder's origins seems to serve as a really strong, albeit maybe unfair, shortcut or proxy for trustworthiness.
And this held up even when they checked other things.
Yeah, they ran lots of robustness checks. They controlled for founder demographics like gender, age, education, experience. They looked at scenarios where founders still lived where they were born or where founders came from the same region as the accelerator. The core finding remained solid.
Okay, so the signal is real and it's powerful. But is it always the same strength? Or did they find situations where this country of origin ethics signal mattered more or maybe mattered less?
Yes, and this is where it gets even more nuanced and I think really interesting. They found that the effect isn't always the same. It's moderated, meaning its strength changes depending on the institutional environment in the country where the venture is actually headquartered.
Okay, moderated by the HQ country's environment. How so?
Well, they looked at two types of institutions, formal and informal. And basically, stronger institutions in the HQ country weaken the positive effect of the founder origin ethics signal.
Weaken it. So if your company's based somewhere with strong institutions, that positive boost you get from your founder's perceived ethical background is smaller.
Exactly. Think about formal institutions first. Things like strong legal systems, effective regulation, good protection for minority investors, low corruption, rule of law.
Right, the official rules and enforcement.
If your venture is operating in a country that already has a robust legal and regulatory framework, that framework itself provides a kind of safety net. It constrains opportunistic behavior. There are checks and balances in place.
Okay, so the system itself provides some assurance, making the signal from the founder's background less critical.
Precisely. The need to rely on that potentially fuzzy country of origin signal decreases because the local environment offers more concrete assurances.
And what about informal institutions? What did they look at there?
That was mainly about social capital. Things like the general level of trust between people in a society, strong social norms, dense social networks, essentially the cultural fabric.
Like how much people trust each other, follow unwritten rules.
Exactly. And they found the same pattern. In countries with high social capital, where there's a lot of trust and strong norms against unethical behavior, that also weakens the positive effect of the founder's country of origin ethics signal.
Why?
Because again, the local environment provides an alternative constraint. Strong social norms and the potential for social sanctions, like damaging your reputation, discourage bad behavior, making the accelerator less reliant on the signal from where the founders were born.
Okay, so whether it's strong laws or strong social trust in the HQ country, both make that founder origin signal less important because there are other mechanisms ensuring good conduct.
That's the key finding on moderation. The signal matters most, it seems, when the venture is headquartered in a place with weaker formal or informal institutions.
That actually makes a lot of intuitive sense. It's like the signal fills a gap in assurance. Did they find anything else that changed how important the signal was?
Yes. One more interesting wrinkle. They found that the positive effect of the perceived ethics signal was significantly stronger for accelerator programs that actually guaranteed some kind of financing to the startups they admitted.
Stronger when money was guaranteed. Why would that be?
The logic here is about risk exposure for the accelerator. If an accelerator is putting its own capital on the line, guaranteeing funding,
They have more skin in the game.
exactly, they have more skin in the game. They face a bigger potential loss if the founders turn out to be untrustworthy or engage in moral hazard, acting recklessly once they have the money.
Right.
So for these programs providing funding, that perceived ethics signal, that proxy for trustworthiness, becomes even more valuable in their decision-making process. They scrutinize it more closely, perhaps.
Okay, that adds another important layer. The signal matters. It matters less in strong institutional environments, and it matters more when the accelerator's writing a check.
You've got it. That sums up the core findings nicely.
So let's pull this all together. Thinking about the implications, what's the main takeaway for you entrepreneurs out there listening, the ones maybe polishing up their own accelerator applications?
I think it's a bit of a reality check, isn't it? It says that beyond your pitch deck, your traction, your team's direct experience, which are all obviously vital, these factors related to your founder's origins, specifically the perceptions others hold about the corporate ethics in those countries, might actually be influencing your admission chances.
Yeah, that's probably not something most founders actively think about when applying.
Probably not. And tied to that, the environment where your venture is based, its legal system, its social trust levels, that matters too, especially if you're targeting programs offering cash.
So it's not advice on, like, who to pick for your founding team based on nationality.
No, definitely not. It's more about providing insight into the complex signals, some quite subtle, that accelerators might be using, consciously or not, to navigate uncertainty. It helped maybe understand some of those rejections that feel unexplained.
And what about for policymakers? Any lessons there?
I think there's a clear message. Investing in strengthening a country's institutional environment, improving the rule of law, boosting regulatory quality, fostering social capital and trust might actually help local entrepreneurs overcome potential biases related to perceptions of their home country.
So building strong institutions locally could provide an alternative signal of trustworthiness, helping entrepreneurs compete more fairly on the global stage, regardless of where they were born.
That seems to be the implication. If the local system provides robust assurances against misconduct, then global players like accelerators might rely less on potentially broad and maybe inaccurate stereotypes linked to country of origin. It levels the playing field somewhat.
It's about building trust through the system itself. Now, the study sounds really thorough, but I assume the researchers mentioned some limitations, things they couldn't quite capture.
They did, yeah. They were pretty upfront about it. For example, they didn't have super detailed info on every single accelerator, so they couldn't fully unpack how maybe the accelerator's own mission or focus might interact with this effect beyond just the funding aspect.
Okay. And the application process itself, it's often more than just the initial form, right? Interviews, pitches.
Exactly. Their data was mainly from the initial application stage. They couldn't track ventures through interviews or mentor matching phases, though they did suggest that these initial perceptions based on origin could very well influence how founders are perceived in those later, more subjective stages too.
That makes sense. A first impression bias.
Could be. And the data was anonymized, which is good for privacy, but meant they couldn't link applications to external databases to get even more venture details. They position these as good avenues for future research to build on what they found.
Understood. Limitations are always part of the research process. So wrapping up our deep dive today, the core takeaway is that these perceptions about the ethical climate back where founders were born seem to act as a surprisingly potent signal influencing admission to impact accelerators. It's a proxy for trustworthiness.
Right, and a signal whose importance fades a bit when the startup itself is operating in a country with strong laws and high social trust, because those provide their own reassurances. But it gets stronger when guaranteed funding is on the table.
So hopefully you've now got a much clearer view of some of these less discussed dynamics shaping the very competitive world of accelerator admissions. It seems sometimes signals tied to where you come from can speak surprisingly loudly.
And it leaves us with a final thought to maybe mull over. How do these broad country-level perceptions, essentially generalizations captured in surveys, end up impacting the real-world opportunities available to individual entrepreneurs, each with their own unique character and values? What does this tell us about the power and perhaps the pitfalls of national reputation in today's global startup scene?
Definitely something to think about.